Reading the Most Sublime Hysteric by Slavoj Zizek, notes on the fourth chapter. Here we reprise our investigation into the dialectic as logic of the signifier with a proposition which we may recognize from earlier, of every ensemble as it were having or requiring a constitutive exception for the bounded field of its exteriority to be marked. Conceptually, and in a step which would bear significant import for the history of philosophy, we are presented with a defined differentiation between abstract and concrete universality. Abstract universality, drawing from the logic of the signifier, functions as a whole on the basis of its oppositional or constitutive exception, whereas concrete universality is a totality with no exterior, rendering it therefore absolute and therefore contradictory. Now, some of you may say that this might correspond to the Kantian distinction between noumena and phenomena, but we do get to that in this and the subsequent chapter. To be sure, however, we must be careful to mark where this moment of exception may be to any signifying mechanism, for it is never really the difference between a signifier and what it means, which in itself is arbitrary. The difference is not the same as the whole and the exception that constitute it. This difference is not the same as the whole and the exception that constitutes it. With regard to this whole, it is the exception that guarantees its closure and universality. We hence have here two spheres or orders of difference, if you prefer. The external limit of language is concrete reality. The internal limit of la langue is difference itself. If I may take the liberty of doing so, we may say that la langue is the inflection of jouissance in language, at the point where the force of a desire searches or punctuates the signifier. Indeed, this cut in the signifying chain may perhaps be likened to the appearance of an idea. At the level of the thing itself, we see in Marx the condition for the universalization of the function of the commodity, i.e., commodity exception is labor itself, in whose exercise we have the conjunction of exchange value and use value. Let me repeat this. At the level of the thing itself, we see in Marx the condition for the universalization of the function of the commodity, i.e., commodity exception is labor itself, in whose exercise we have the conjunction of exchange value and use value, being that which produces value itself, traded and materialized in the form of prices. What then would it mean following Lacan that the truth is pas tout, or i.e., not all? The answer is that it is not to be found in the difference between a signifier and a reference, but within the signifier itself. The real here is identified with the internal limit of la langue, or the unseizable boundary that prevents it from becoming itself. In other words, like the Hegelian interdiction to Kant, the bar that separates the symbolic from the real is inside the symbolic field itself. How, however, would we identify the real, which, unlike reality, is grasped initially as a hard kernel, or that which always returns to the same place? Kripke would go as far as to assert that the kernel would remain the same in all possible symbolic universes. What makes the traumatic event if that is the hard kernel resisting symbolic assimilation is not presented in its positivity. We are told that its consistency depends on the phantasmic construction that obfuscates the void, like the notion of structural causality presented by Althusser. Its effectivity consists in its effects, hence the matter as to whether it occurred in reality matters little. The real as such is initially identified with a fortuitous encounter, a contingency that derails symbolic automatism, perhaps augmenting its circuit if not blocking it. Yet, as contingency which intrudes, it cannot be pinned down but only constructed, such as the purely logical consistency of an X that eludes a structure, but is only discernible via its role in the structure. The other facet which is emphasized is contradictory to the usual emphasis of the real as that which resists symbolization, that which never stops writing itself. In this sense, we are presented with a semblant of the real which is potentially agential, as opposed to enigmatic and opaque. Yet what is included, however, to accommodate this modification, perhaps in the expression of its difference from the signifier. Writing, hence, as an expression of the drive, also is that which returns to the same place, as it were, and is as such objectual and real. We are prodded, as it were, that this act is beyond, or more precisely below, possible subjectifications, and as such does not represent the subject. Presenting this is Kripke's critique of the theory of descriptions. The real appears to be the surplus of the quod over the quid, the pure that of an object without properties. This appears to be dangerous, for what we seem to be doing is presenting the real of trauma precisely that which resists symbolization and yet appears to have a host of properties. This, we are warned, were it to be a fantasy projection on the void, though I am tempted to say of the void, in the symbolic other, in an entity whose existence is to be refused. This refusal, however, may not alter its ontological consistency or its existential import. The conception of labor presented here entails an antagonism, as it were, analogous perhaps to the primordial patricide, but more viscerally a fight to the death between two subjects for recognition, in which loss entails slavery and bondage. Habermas, a critic of Hegel in 1971, argued that we have on one hand a relationship of the subject to the object, to nature, and on the other, symbolic interaction, or the relationship of subjects to each other. The question that Slavoj reads as repressed by such a distinction, and which acts apparently as a critique of the attempted Habermasian reconciliation that is raised by Hegel, is what is the intersubjective symbolic economy of work itself, of the instrumental relationship to objectivity. Marxism acknowledges social relationships of domination operating at a level determined by the development of productive forces, thereby acting as a function of the development and the organization of the force of labor itself. In terms of the Hegelian approach to such a depiction, we are left with what is merely an ambiguous likening of the master-slave dialectic. From Hegel's phenomenology of spirit as the point where he comes closest to historical materialism, and with the assertion that truth is on the side of the slave laborer. The struggle amidst the myriad of representations it may take, be they historical struggles between modes of production, thematic ones between aesthetic registers, representational differences in congregations, or indeed interpretive differences in the law, require, as it were, a form of narrative for their comprehension. Here, sorting through the disparate elements, scraps of evidence, testimony, circumstantial evidence, etc., reveals, as it were, a plethora of instances where the ends don't meet, as it were, or are explicitly at odds with each other. At the level of theory, Jacques-Alain Miller presents this as the problem between consistency and logical consistency. Investigation here consists in how it may be possible to think their simultaneous conjunction of what may often be opposing or contradictory determinations. Indeed, this is a beautiful formula for the real. Figuratively, this is likened to the Hegelian critique of Kant, though this is elucidated by a rather rushed explanation. Opposition in the psychoanalytic tradition Zizek is working with also carries with it the Lacanian contextual frames of mind. The imaginary or the pre-symbolic level is one which is seen to represent the subjective harmony, even if it is complementarily produced. Impressions made on one's disposition upon witnessing a watercolor painting, for example, may correspond to this. Another would be that of a fulfilling sexual union, such as when a woman and a man form an accomplished whole. The symbolic, as the name may indicate, functions via differentiality, much like the way a signifier derives its meaning in terms of its opposition, even its subtractive dimension that sets it apart from synonyms, or perhaps more explicitly, in antonyms, where a term as it were serves as, apart from itself, the lack in its other, or to expand it, where an element works to exemplify the other's lack, or constitutive absence. The real here would be an immediate, perhaps even short-circuited conjunction of these opposites, thus rendering them unreadable. The 0 point of the dialectical process where each passes directly into its other. Despite the Hegelian dialectical process fashioning a key perhaps to unlock the logic at work in such a conjuncture, the real, at least in its Lacanian formulation, is an inscription formalizable only on the basis of its impasse. Or perhaps in even more naive terms, a heterogeneity too disparate to be thought a constituting principle, likened as it were to the failure of its own inscription. In each of these stages, which may, I suppose, be likened to the interpretive moments, we have a sorting amidst and synthesization of disparities, be they elements of a plot or whatever. And this consequent unformed result in the identification of the signifying mechanism, even perhaps the logic of its expression, which I think, at least since Peter Deuce's book mentioned earlier in the last video, we identify in their congruence. We map it as it were a symbolic structure, even if its mode of realization does not complete the signifying chain, hence not reaching jouissance. This fragment, as it were, or incomplete map charts what the missed encounter is in its effectivity, an unutilized if not unknown facility, even if our attempts create the intuition of where its outlines may be discernible. As Zizek puts it, instead of saying we missed the object, we should understand the object as this missed encounter. To emphasize the point, Jacques-Alain Miller is cited that the subject itself is one of the responses of the real. At its most basic, visceral level, Lacan offers us some consolation by reminding us that substance begins, if not adheres, in the jouissant body. Indeed, substance is first of all the big other, the order that gives birth to the subject. And I think this duality, both the inherence of the substance to the body and its primary identification as the big other, are important markers to meditate on. As such, as much as substance may be constitutive of the big other, as it were, it may also function as its constituent exception, inasmuch as it is substance that makes the big other, representing perhaps in another moment its extimate kernel. In another cautionary remark, we are reminded that insisting on a very sharp schism between true reality and psychic reality may not make very much sense to any subject. Zizek describes it as a contradiction in adjecto, to which I might add a recipe for the production of neurosis. Furthermore, any such construction which alienates jouissance from the articulation of the subject's symbolic reality may indeed harm the subject, and I have tried to raise this matter elsewhere under the rubric of bodily alienation. As far as analysis is concerned, even within an orthodox Lacanian frame, it may well be true that the real does not exist, and yet it may be possible to discern aspects of the truth from it, perhaps even in the act of transference. And indeed, at its most rudimentary, do we not see this in even the most simplistic models of negation, i.e., that it is night, and I write this down on a piece of paper. Tomorrow, it is afternoon, i.e., it is no longer night, but the paper is still there. The oft-quoted reading of the Hegelian dialectic as the thesis, antithesis, synthesis is radically rewritten by Zizek now in Lacanian terms, as the imaginary, real, symbolic, with the latter second term serving as the impassivity of the former, allowing for what is formulatable but more importantly expressible as the symbolic. A truly novel gesture which at least I have never seen before. What further reinforces this reading, however, is the positing of the antithesis not as somehow already expressed in the thesis itself, however banal this triadic metaphor may be, but as that which the thesis lacks, or better yet, its constitutive exception required for it to achieve its concentration. In other words, this is not complementary inasmuch as it is its negation in the strong sense of the term, its own negation, as it were. The rereading of the synthesis which may now be formed is one which is as path-breaking for the tradition of the radical enlightenment as it is for decolonial theory. The thing holding the two symbolic alternates together is not their mutual fulfillment of a lack, but their common lack. Indeed, Zizek seems to be implying an extent of metaphysical intersubjectivity when he states that the terms become one against the background of their common lack, and each sends or expresses to the other. That each sends or expresses to the other. The synthesis that is produced, if that is indeed the symbolic, no longer has to work as an affirmation of difference as such. In his own words, the synthesis liberates difference from the compulsion of identity, because it means we no longer have to look for the resolution of the contradiction in the identity of the extremes. What we are actually presented with is contradiction as the non-identity itself under the aspect of identity. These are my notes on the fourth chapter of the most sublime hysteric, Zizek's doctoral dissertation. And I would leave a link to the original text where I actually put together notes on both the fourth and fifth chapters, and will present a reading of the fifth one in the subsequent video. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.